I'm Sarah Krakoff, and I met Rose in 1989. It was her first year of law school, so we're following roughly in order of Rose's life, although we're all kind of going back and forth. Because, of course, once you know Rose, you don't let her go. It's a good thing that Berkeley was so stodgy and conservative when we were in law school, or we might never have met. I was a year ahead of Rose, and it's kind of a big place. And then I would have missed out on a friendship with one of the best humans on the planet. I don't remember the exact moment of our first encounter, and I sort of regret that. On the other hand, I do think once you know Rose, you do feel like you've known her forever. So I think it's no accident. I don't remember the exact moment. But in all likelihood, it was at a meeting for the Coalition for a Diversified Faculty, or it could have been one of the other 6 or 10 other activist groups we were both involved in, but I think it was probably CDF. Rose went to law school to continue her life's work that you've already heard some about, of making the world a more just, humane, and beautiful place. So, of course, she didn't let up on that as a student at all, and Rose just took on whatever the important battle was in front of her. Her talents as a political organizer were abundant. She was braver, calmer, and stronger than most, and she was also more organized than most. Watching Rose not only be on the front lines, but also keep track of lists and names and being on top of things like stuffing mailboxes. For those of you too young to know what a mailbox is, it's a physical thing you had to stuff with flyers and so forth back in the day. But it really made me understand, I guess sort of strangely for the first time, why the term is in fact organizer and not something else. That part of Rose's personality also made her everyone's go-to person for help with school. She had the best class notes and kept up with all the reading. I mean, and this is amazing, really, given everything else that we were doing. It's kind of like her dual life as Willie Brown's, chief of outreach, and then activist and organizer by night. She really was an amazing student in addition to everything else. She was sort of the Catholic schoolgirl in her, I think, wouldn't let up. So fierce activist in between being the top-notch law student. And so back to that activism, I think I'll just share one story because Rose loved this story so much. In addition to organizing annual student strikes for the Coalition for Diversified Faculty and sitting in the dean's office on a regular basis and just making ourselves generally an annoyance and irritation to the school, which was our mission. And the background is that at the time, and there were much bigger things you already heard about them that Rose worked on her whole life, but as an activist and a person who cares about justice, you do what you need to do where you are. And at the time, Bolt's faculty was amazingly, Bolt is the old name for Berkeley Law School, was amazingly undiverse. Like I said, conservative and stodgy. There were 2 tenured women and 2 tenured white women and 1 tenured person of color, an African-American man, on the Berkeley Law faculty at the time. This is the late 80s. So we monitored faculty hiring and were in constant, let's just call it, conversation with the dean's office. We had been told that there were no faculty positions one fall semester, and therefore there would be no hiring going on. And then we found out that offers had been made to 2 white people, a white couple. And so we felt like this wasn't fair and we'd been left out of the loop. And so we decided to send this couple a letter telling them about the ongoing struggles at Berkeley Law over diversity and asking them, in solidarity to consider not coming. And it was a very polite, tactful letter. I know I still have it somewhere. Rose and I were not the only ones to sign it, but in the interest of protecting people, I won't name all the names. We had a lot of friends working with us on this. But, you know, we just thought this was, of course, the right thing to do, and Rose always knew what that was, right? She always knew what the right thing to do was. So we sent them this letter. As we soon learned, this would be considered fairly outrageous by the administration, our professors, on whom we relied for grades, letters of recommendation, and so forth. And I just remember sitting across from Rose at Cafe Strada, across from the law school there. I think it was still called Cafe Roma back then. And just watching Rose calmly sign this letter. I mean, she didn't even think, I mean, it's not that she didn't think about it. She thought about everything, but she didn't consider for 1 second the adverse possible consequences to all of us. And I really do think that's how she did all of her good work. She really had the most accurate moral compass of anyone I had ever met, and I think I will ever meet. So we signed the letter, sent it off. And I think it was during winter break. And when we came back, the school was in a total uproar. A fellow student who shockingly didn't agree with our cause had stuffed every single student mailbox with a letter calling for punitive action towards us and naming us all by name. Many of our professors were affronted and angry, and it was a very dramatic time. But Rose was never flustered or nervous. When she knew the importance of a cause, she just didn't worry about the personal cost to her. She always saw clearly that the bigger picture mattered more than our fragile egos or momentary concerns. And in fact, this story about the mailboxes and the letters and the outrage became something we told and just laughed about again and again over the years. And I'm sure you all have your own stories like this with Rose, like driving around throwing the paint at the billboards. So that's just one of many stories I know and I'm sure all of us could tell. There are too many like that to share here, and Rose, in her own words, according to Cassandra, didn't want us going on and on. And I could just picture her saying that. But I do have to tell you just the brief summary of her other work during law school, and this is, remember, just three short years. She worked with the National Lawyers Guild and defended political protesters while in law school. She spent a semester in Geneva working on international human rights, and there she did a report on human rights abuses in jails in Burma, and I remember getting a letter from her. Letters, do I have to go over that one for the young people? You write them and send them in the mail. On that flimsy, you know, long-distance airmail stationery, telling me this helpful advice: Sarah, don't ever get thrown in jail in Burma. I thought, okay, check. And then after law school, she went to work for a criminal defense practice where she did a range of work, including continuing to defend political protesters and some civil rights litigation. I didn't know that Joe helped out serve one of those lawsuits. It was nice of her to include you in her life's work, Joe. And then she went on, of course, to transition to working with critical resistance, and Ruthie's going to talk more about that. And you all know that was just Rose, of course, always at the forefront of movements that people later figure out about and latch onto. Oh, putting lots of humans in prisons is bad. Like, Rose knew that before many politicians and so forth. To know Rose as a friend is to always seek out her warm, steady, and comfortable personality. I think part of her genius as an activist was that everyone just felt better around Rose, which made being close to a fiery and courageous protester unusually calming. So Rose and I stayed in as close touch as we could over the years since law school. Rose was also very good at that, tending friendships. She came to my wedding, I went to hers. She visited after my daughter Lucy was born, and you know from the photos she did a lot of that. I think, as Brent said one time we were watching photos of her, there are a lot of pictures of Rose and babies. She visited and held all your babies. I tacked on days in Oakland or San Francisco whenever travel allowed. And we did a lot of just the ordinary fun things Rose loved. We ate Zachary's pizza and went afterwards to Double Rainbow ice cream. I'm still mad at them for closing on Rose's behalf. We walked her quirky rescue dogs, Charlotte and then Frosty. We went hiking in Point Reyes, and we always reminisced and laughed. As for many of us here, Rose was my hero. She really was. She was my hero. I remember during a moment of wondering what the hell I was doing in my life, I just said to myself, I'm just going to try to be a little bit more like Rose every day. This was several years ago now. It's still my mantra. But she was also just my friend. She was the best person I knew, but completely relatable. That was part of her magic. She was brave, fearless, kind, warm, regular, and funny, and beautiful in the deep inside-out sense. Like many of us, I'm still very confused and angry about losing Rose and that she had to suffer. I'm really, really pissed about that. It makes the world seem a bit cruel and mean. But on the other hand, and I think Rose would want us to understand this, that it was a beautiful world that had Rose in it at all. And how lucky we were, how lucky I know that I was, that I got to meet her. A world that produced a Rose Braz has something right. I will always miss Rose, but I will never forget her. And I will always be grateful that life tossed me her way. And I will try every day, always, to be a little bit more like Rose. And finally, I want to send my love and gratitude to Rose's family, her dad, Ray, her brother, Joe, and her outstanding and supportive and loving husband, Brent. Thanks for taking care of Rose and loving her the way she deserved. And thanks to all of you for letting me share my thoughts with Rose. I'll let the next person, Ruthie, come up.
Good afternoon. So Rose Braz, I should tell you who I am. I'm Ruthie Gilmore. And I came rather late into Rose's life. We were friends for 20 years. We met in the late fall of 1997. It's part of the organizing collective for critical resistance, the conference that happened in 1998. And when I arrived at my first meeting, the collective had already been meeting for a little bit. She was the one, before all others, who welcomed me to the group, who sat with me, who explained what was going on, who laughed with me. And we almost immediately started sharing ice cream, as Sarah mentioned, and we did that throughout our beautiful friendship. But where I was going to start is that Rose Braz was the best organizer I ever knew, I could ever have known. A few years ago, after decades of increases, the decline in the number of people in prison and jail in the United States of America was big news. California's key role in the story rarely made headlines. And when California's big policy shift, realignment, got attention, few bothered to ask what lay beneath rather than above the surface of such dramatic change. Fewer still than ever reckoned the broadening and deepening grassroots power of abolition, whose primary organizational force was Rose Braz. During the past 2 decades, general understanding of abolition has gone from a utopian notion whose proponents were memorably ridiculed by a journalist who called Rose and her co-organizers Bolshevik bimbos. Remember that? From that to an urgent goal invoked by mainstream media and policy wonks. Critical resistance brought abolition into contemporary political consciousness, and Rose did more than anybody to shape prison abolition into an imaginative and expansive movement with its feet on the ground, always, always, always moving in practical ways. Rose rose to the connected challenges to make abolition a practical guide to political organizing. She was a champ at finding intermediate goals that would leave the system smaller, weaker, more vulnerable. She figured out how to work with groups that were not, or not yet, abolitionist, at a time when the not quite yet movement seemed pie in the sky idealism to many. She strove to achieve concrete victories to attract more people and resources to the fight. And she insisted that campaigns improve the lives of people in prison, of recently released people, and those at risk of going in order to demonstrate that abolition was not only about some future heaven. In short, Rose devoted her energy and ingenuity and breathtaking network of friends and comrades to develop specific non-reformist, or what Avery Gordon calls abolitionist, reforms. The September 1998 Critical Resistance Conference launched awareness of how many were already in the struggle as 3,500 people gathered for 3 days across the Bay. Rose was one of the few dozen organizers, as I mentioned, who brought that conference into being, and her force and her imagination kept what we had produced for those 3 days going. The organizers' mantra, all of us shared this, was, "This is a campaign, not a conference." Remember that? A campaign, not a conference. Several weeks after the event was over, we met around a vast table at now-defunct Heller Ehrman law offices to specify what that campaign that we kept invoking should be. And while many of us had concerns that we held dear, youth, for example, or political prisoners, women, queer and gender nonconforming people, elders, there was very little clarity on what a campaign would or should look like. We met again and persuaded Rose to be Critical Resistance first part-time staffer with the title Campaign Director, and so it began. When in 1999, Gray Davis, then governor of California, announced plans to build another mega prison in the United Farm Workers' historic home of Delano, Critical Resistance and the Prison Moratorium Project began a 6-year campaign to stop that prison. Though it was built, the effort that Rose made with her comrades made a concretely interrupted California's 2-decade-long prison building spree. So up until this time, California had opened a prison a year for 23 years. In that time, she and the people and organizations she gathered and inspired and cajoled into coordinated motion defined through specific projects what abolition actually is as an ongoing life and world-changing practical politics. And I keep saying practical because I mean it. One of the amazing things about this woman was her unerring practicality combined with a vision that saw no possibility of admitting defeat. So some of the projects that got going as a result of this campaign to stop the Delano II prison included Education Not Incarceration, an outreach project to teachers, K-12 teachers, that produced, among other things, a massive visit to the state legislature in Sacramento of children from all over California to plead on their own behalf for resources for schools and not for prisons, as well as a template for the National Education Association to use to spread the thinking, education, not incarceration, throughout, by way of the union, throughout the United States. It also, picking up on the education theme, meant that Rose developed her relationship, her long-standing deep relationship with people, including Andy Shaw-Caron, who I know is here this afternoon, who was then active in the SEIU and also a teacher inside prison, to make common cause with the SEIU And after years and years of working on developing this relationship, we eventually did, in fact, achieve a meeting that turned into more movement building with the SEIU. And the way we talked about it was that in having that meeting that Rose was so central in making happen, we went from being 6 people to 500,006 people fighting against the prisons in California. Rose did an enormous amount of the kind of nuts and boltsy budget work in which we would roll over to Sacramento and talk to legislative staffers and talk to oh gosh, I can't think of the name of it, legislative analyst's office, to talk about ways to take the resources, and our goal was, of course, to take the resources and the captive people from the prison system and put that to the work of making people's lives better, whether education, health, welfare. We didn't want to save money. We wanted to spend it differently. We never wanted to save a penny. And also, Rose, with her amazing imagination and her relationship with so many people doing so many different kinds of movement work in every area of the struggle for social justice, developed insights that turned into part of the campaign against the Delano II prison that focused on environmentalism and biological diversity and also environmental justice. So we had those 2 things going on as well. So we were working with grassroots organizations, environmental justice organizations, throughout the California Central Valley, as well as the Center for Biological Diversity and other organizations that were striving, for example, to save the lonely Tipton kangaroo rat. This was the scope of our work. Rose's legacy includes most forcefully an approach to organizing that shrinks the prison system and shrinks the other systems that shorten the lives of the kinds of people who were the people who produced Rose Braz in the first place, her family and loved ones. That shrinks the system by growing our capacity through education, organized labor, and environmental activism and environmental justice to make the world we want and need. Rose changed the world because no matter what the challenge, whether fighting against a CCPOA lobbyist or playing a game of charades, she hated to lose. She worked and she played joyfully to win. Rose Braz showed us how to be and how to do, combining and showing us how to combine restless curiosity, individual modesty, and enormous collective ambition, plus a flair for funk aerobics. Rose Braz, presente. And now Kassie's going to come up to speak.
I'm Kassie Siegel. I'm going to talk about Rose's work at the Center for Biological Diversity. Rose joined the center in 2009, and she brought all of her skill and talent to fighting the climate crisis. She took the climate world by storm, and she made our program what it is today. With no organizing staff at that time but her army of volunteers and interns, she quickly transformed the climate organizing landscape. She founded Climate Reality Check, which is now the largest network working to strengthen grassroots organizing on climate with 1,600 members representing millions of people. She co-founded Americans Against Fracking and Californians Against Fracking, the statewide coalition of more than 200 organizations working to ban fracking and dangerous drilling in California. She worked constantly to build ties between those working on climate, on environmental and social justice, on human liberation, on labor, and on faith. Rose made things that are hard for most of us look so easy. She was an incredible mentor, facilitator, strategist. She brought her incredible sense of humor and playfulness to even the most difficult situations. When Rose got sick, I was so awed that there was absolutely nothing that she wanted to change. She was presented for real with the question many of us ponder in real life. What would you do if the doctor told you you had about a year left to live? Rose was already living so well, she had no regrets and nothing to change. Her work was activism, and activism was inseparable from who she was. And even with the terrible suffering that she endured during her illness, her determination to keep working was fierce. During the time she battled brain cancer, she continued to lead and to inspire us all. In 2015, with substantial neurological deficits, she conceived and assembled from Oakland the most impactful work at the Paris Climate Talks. She organized 2 panels with luminaries from around the world promoting the international movement to ban fracking and keep fossil fuels in the ground, and the only raucous protest to take place outside the conference venue in Paris, completely surrounded by the French military and police. Rose had help from a lot of wonderful people in this work, but she was its driving force, even as the doctors told her that she had very little time left to live. Rose played a huge role in supporting fracking bans that have now passed in 6 California counties. And last November, the most recent and significant of those bans went to the voters in Monterey County, which, by the way, it might surprise you to hear, is the state's 4th largest oil-producing county, with oil dirtier than what comes from the Alberta tar sands. At this time, she was suffering an enormous burden of symptoms. She couldn't really read or write, she couldn't see much on the right side, and she was losing a lot of short-term memory function. Most of the time, riding in any kind of moving vehicle was torture because it made her so dizzy and so nauseous. But Rose wanted to do everything she could still do to help pass the fracking ban. So we went down to Monterey County, and as a team we walked precincts, and I took the clipboard and the pen, and she took the pamphlets, and we went door to door. And the physical challenge of that task at that time was enormous. It was a struggle to take the flyer and hang it on the doorknob. But even then, her ability to connect with people, to laugh with them, and to change their minds was amazing. She had this beautiful exchange with one young mother who mentioned that her daughter's name was Rose. And when we left that house, our Rose had secured yet another vote. And on election night, we were back at the hotel after celebrating the passage of the fracking ban and watching the horror of the federal election. And it was 2 o'clock in the morning, and I was struggling to write an email to our coworkers that might say something helpful at this terrible time. And I read her what I had written, and just as she had so many times before, she told me exactly what it needed to be complete and to be right. She was horribly ill for several days after that trip from the extraordinary exertion that it took, but she still knew exactly what to say and do at one of life's hardest moments. The only person that I've ever known who has strength and stoicism just exactly like Rose is her father, Ray. And I can never thank you enough, Raymond Braz, for giving us the great gift of Rose. As her disease progressed towards her death, she continued to send messages of love and hope to all of her comrades. And at the very end, she said she didn't want anybody to be sad when she was gone, but she wanted us all to keep fighting to win. Rose told us to be bold. She told us not to be too cautious about what we ask for or about what we dream about. She said it's easy to agree and we want to agree, but it's harder to be a little more out there. She said you need to build those relationships. You have to respect others' events. You have to sign those sign-on letters, show up and show solidarity. You need to be there for your allies, and then when it's time to be bold, you can do it, and people will know you and respect you. Rose had an unlimited capacity for love. She brought people together like no one else I've ever known. Like all of you, I loved Rose so very much, and I'm so sorry that we've lost her from the physical world. But I carry her with me in my heart now, and I feel her presence every day as we all carry on the many projects that she launched. What I want most right now is to work with each and every single one of you with every day that we have left to make the world as Rose dreamed it. And as Rose always said in conclusion, and it was never a cliche, thank you so much for coming, and thank you for everything that you do.